In 1992, Ring the Bell became a rallying call for the then leader of the opposition Free National Movement, Hubert Ingram, as he pushed for elections to be called. That was a different kind of Free National Movement, pushing through the barriers of Bahamian politics. And that man who demanded the government to ring the bell would soon be deemed the delivery boy, delivering the government to eager FNMs. The Bahamas was never the same. On August 19, 1992, the delivery boy Hubert Ingram won the election for the FNM, sending Sir Lyndon Pinling and his 25-year administration home in shock. Two very memorable things happened that night of August 19th, FNM deliverance, and the heavens opened with a lightning and thunderstorm. The FNM headquarters welcomed thousands who walked and stood in the rain to hear the victory speech of the delivery boy. It was indeed a moment in history. For some, sense of freedom, hope, courage, and even curiosity to see what was next for the nation. 30 years after that historic night, we discuss the FNM 30 years since the call to governance. I'm your host, Jerome Sawyer. Our discussion begins on the other side of this break.
So the project really pays itself back.
Correct.
They set up
at the conference, the school.
As a journalist, I always have to focus on the facts, and sometimes that means going to investigate for myself. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. right here on RTV.
And welcome to our show. Alvin Smith, former Speaker of the House of Assembly, and Johnny Ann Dorset, former MP for the Fox Hill constituency, joining us tonight. Both Mr. Smith and Mrs. Dorset served in the Senate in 1992, in the 1992 period, in the first Ingram administration. Mr. Smith went on to become the MP for North Eleuthera, serving from 1997 to 2012. And in 1997, Mrs. Dorset became the Member of Parliament for Fox Hill. She also served in the Senate during the former Minnis administration. That's a mouthful. Welcome to On the Record.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So this show really, for me, is about historical context. As the Free National Movement gets ready to celebrate the 30th anniversary of their first win, that represented a change in the political landscape in so many ways in the Bahamas, and I think ushered in a new era in so many ways. So let's go back, if we will, to 30 years ago. What was the political landscape at that time? We're just ahead of the elections. The PLP had been in power for 25 years uninterrupted. The FNM had a new leader in Hubert Ingram. I think it was 1990. The late Sir Cecil Wallace Whitfield passed away. Hubert Ingram, a former PLP cabinet minister who was an independent, now became the leader of the Free National Movement going into that 1992 election. Take us back to the political landscape, and what was it like?
Well, I feel that at that time, few people thought of the FNM or any other political party as posing a serious challenge to the PLP. And, you know, you came along and you ran, but it was almost like window dressing. No one expected that anyone other than the PLP would win the election. And I think that view started to change somewhat, even back from 1987, when, you know, the election was really quite close, in my opinion. But 1992 really showed that the electorate could bring about change, that you didn't have to accept the status quo, that you can make a decision as to who you want to govern you.
Mr. Smith, take us back to that time, 30 years ago. New leader, PLP, 25 years in power. She said people didn't think it could happen.
The FNM had been a bit deflated after the 1987 election because we felt certain that we were going to win the 1987 election. And so we were at our lowest point, probably, because we thought we had the people with us. The rallies, they were overwhelmingly supported, and everything seemed to be in favor of us winning. However, we lost. And then Hubert Ingram coming on in May of 1990, and he brought with him his experience after being a former chairman of the Progressive Liberal Party. He was a minister for a couple of years, and he brought a level of organization that I had not seen before. But he was very meticulous with the details. Register, and he would be stern with us. Make sure you find every person physically who's on the register. You don't want persons who are on the register who's not living where they say they are living based on the register. But he wants us to just scrutinize carefully and thoroughly the register. And then he brought, even as it relates to our headquarters, how it was organized, and everybody had a role to play. And everybody was, those persons who were candidates, they were kept regularly up to date as to what was happening, what was proposed to happen. And I remember when he addressed the FNM in November, it was November 30th of 1990. And he spoke, it brought a level of fresh air and more optimism. And it generated more enthusiasm because he talked about, and what was key, and he was very consistent. Mm-hmm. He talked about accountability, transparency. He talked about, in fact, he talked about stemming out corruption.
Now, these became hallmarks of his administration after the win, which we will get to in a bit, but both of you have referenced the 1987 election. There are many FNMs who believe, even to today, that the PLP did not win the 1987 election. But following that election and coming into the 92 election, the indelible ink was introduced for the first time. Mm-hmm. And even following the 87 election, there were a lot of election irregularities, which I think ended up in election court, and there was a lot going on. But how did that 87 election and those factors, how did that really influence how the party went into the 92 election?
I believe that prior to the 92 election, the FNM, and this is just my opinion, saw itself as a family, you know, and they didn't really grasp the whole idea of being a political organization. You know, they came out of the PLP with a certain vision, and the party grew under the leadership of Sir Cecil and Sir Kendall Isaacs. But I think that in 92, as he was talking about Hubert Ingram, I think he moved the party from that family kind of feeling into a political organization, a fierce political organization. So I think that was the change that happened in 92. And we took it, I think, well, we always took it seriously, but I think in 92 was when we really started to dot all the I's and cross all the T's and gather the data and evaluate that kind of thing. So, you know, it kind of, we shifted more into a serious organization.
To that point, do you think the 87 loss really brought about the need for all of these changes? Even today, we still use that indelible ink. And I remember just a lot of the irregularities that came out of the 87 election no longer existed as a result of that indelible ink.
That's right.
It brought about the change. And it offered more security of the vote. It made, well, the FNM themselves felt much better going into the next election. And you remember now, the 87 election, you remember what at the Parliamentary Registration Department, I remember Tennyson Wells went to try and get copies of the register and had difficulties getting copies of the register and that sort of thing. And there were several other irregularities that happened in 1987. But the indelible ink made definitely a difference. And
I think even now when people complain about it, sometimes I think we forget what that means. And you know, there's a cry for us to move forward and update the verification process, but that's a show for another.
Also, there was suspicion of multiple voting.
Yes.
I would share what I know personally. I used to, during the summer, I worked at, I had a cousin who had a charter company. And I know for a fact, hearing a lady who had just voted, and she takes a plane and she's now going to Andros to vote. I'm talking what I heard myself. That's okay, man. She they just voted here, and now she's going to Andros to vote again.
And there were even, I remember there were even stories of people who were deceased who appeared on the register and appearing as voted. You know, so there were a lot of irregularities. But you've talked a lot about the leadership that Hubert Ingram brought to the party. But were people generally ready for a change in government, or was it a combination of things, you think?
I think it was a combination of things. One thing that I recall leading up to the '92 election was the push that was made to have people actually registered. A lot of people would come to rallies, they say they supported the party, and they enjoyed all the trappings around the election, but many of them were not registered, many of them didn't vote. And I think one thing that we sought to do at that time was to educate, particularly the younger people, of the importance of voting and to ensure that they got registered. And I remember that being a big push, to just get people on the register that supported you.
Let's go back now to 1992, August 19th, that night. What were your thoughts when it was clear that the FNM had won the election?
I ran in 1992 in the it was Central Lucia, the Governor's Harbour constituency. That was Central Lucia at the time. So I was in my constituency. But it was the exuberance, the enthusiasm, the energy, the celebration. In fact, it was emotional in my constituency. And then I heard about what happened here in Nassau. And
why the emotion? Why the excitement? Why that outpouring?
Well, after being in opposition for 21 years, and after coming so close and thinking that we had won in 1987, some believed that we will never win. But they were still optimistic that it is possible. And then we have Hubert Ingram. He brought a type of aggression and a style of leadership, and showing no kind of fear and going directly at Mr. Linden. And so the FNM felt, okay, he's quite a match for Sir Linden. And that kind of built up that courage within the party and build up that level of confidence that, yes, we can win because we have a leader who is very, very strong. He's focused. He's organized, he's determined, and so the general public, who probably was kind of more relaxed and just not certain as to what they want to do, I think they start to believe that, you know, Ingram has a chance, the FNM has a chance, and it's time for a change.
I remember the stories of the people who were fearful as to what would happen now that Pinling was no longer the Prime Minister. He had led the country into majority rule and independence, and for many people, it was all they knew. But now here was a new leader. What was that period like? Were people uncertain, or were...
I think a lot of people were uncertain. I recall campaigning in '92 and even the previous election, and we talk about our leader. And I remember people saying to me, well, if Pinling doesn't lead the country, who could do it? As though there was nobody else on the horizon who could lead. And I believe that when we won, when the FNM won in '92, it gave people it just changed the whole idea that, well, we don't have to accept the status quo. Things could change, and we could make it change. And I also believe that Mr. Ingram's story, you know, he always talked about his upbringing and his grandmother and all that. I think that his story resonated with the electorate, particularly with the not so well-to-do people who saw him as one of them. And if he can become Prime Minister, then, you know, anybody can do it. If he can do that, then I can do whatever I want to do. I think that made a difference.
But didn't Pinling Sillinden sell that same narrative that, you know, I'm from among the people, and if I can be Prime Minister, you can as well?
But I don't know if people saw Sillinden in that same light. He came back from London a lawyer, and politics was always kind of, you know, for lawyers and businessmen and all that. And even though Hubert Ingram was himself a lawyer, they looked at him as someone who had come up. He talked about walking barefoot and all that. And so many of us could kind of appreciate that. And, you know, like his life was not much different from a lot of our lives. And I think that resonated with people.
But remember also, that was a period when there was a lot of victimization. And people were afraid to speak out publicly, were afraid. I remember speaking to a friend of mine, and he said, you know, I believe the people are ready for a change, because there was that level of quietness. Like people were not giving their verbal commitment as to what they were going to do. And he really said to me, I believe the people have something in for the PLP. It's a big surprise. Because many persons, particularly if you work for government, you wouldn't dare express how you felt if it was not supporting the PLP. And particularly in the Family Islands, can you imagine persons, if you were not supporting the PLP, there were some persons, those persons that operated mail boats, they refused to take your goods.
Really?
That's right. You couldn't get some of the services, although you were Bahamian, of government. Some of the assistance that social services were offering, ministry. If you were supportive of the FNM, then you could not.
Wow.
Some persons old folks used to get food. I'll tell you, Jerome.
I'm just going to put a plug in there. We've got a break. We're at that point. Hold that story. We will come back to that. Stay with us. We are talking about the FNM's 30-year anniversary, 30 years since the call to government. We're going to take a quick break and be back right after this. So the project really pays itself back.
Correct.
They set up
At the conference, the school.
As a journalist, I always have to focus on the facts, and sometimes that means going to investigate for myself. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. right here on RTV.
You're watching On the Record, and we are discussing FNM 30 years since the call to governance. Welcome back, my esteemed guests, Mr. Alvin Smith and Ms. Johnny Ann Dorset. As we went to the break, so we talked about, or we began speaking about an issue that was very prevalent prior to the 1992 election. Some say it still exists in some ways, but there was a lot of fear amongst certain sectors, people whether they worked in government or elsewhere, about speaking out for fear of victimization, whether it was perceived or real, but there was a real fear.
There was a real fear. And there are many persons who would tell you about their experiences. Family Islands particularly, but everywhere. I can recall persons sharing, as I said earlier, about to the point where even the government stopped goods from coming to them on the mailboat. So they had to go through somebody else to get their goods delivered to them. And accessing government services. My grandmother, who was a supporter of the PLP, she got food voucher. Then you have a Mrs. McQueen in Hudson Bay, who was a staunch supporter of the FNM. And she was an older lady. She could not even get the same vouchers. It had stopped. Well, she used to get it, but it stopped. They stopped it. So my grandmother used to give the voucher that she got, or the food items that she got, to this lady. You know. But also, you know, I think what factored into the change is that it was only about, what, 8 years since we came out of the reports of the drug trade. Bahamian, their life was negatively impacted. The quality of their life was deteriorating. There was the level, the type of crimes that we had never seen before, the type of violence we had never seen before.
So I do want to jump to that because there was, and it all started really with the NBC report by Brian Ross,
right.
Which implicated high-ranking government officials in the Bahamas involved in illicit drugs, and
right.
that precipitated a commission of inquiry.
That's right.
Nothing really came out of the commission of inquiry, I mean, all things considered. But how do you think that eroded at the hold that the PLP had at that time? And how did you think people viewed that?
I feel that what that report did is that it kind of tarnished or the image that people had of Linden and the government on the whole, and people started to see them as corrupt. So I think that was really part of their downfall, that whole drug connection that came out of it. I know what we heard officially, and on the street some of the reports were even worse, and they circulated among the whole populace, and I think that kind of removed the rose-colored glasses from the PLP.
But you had, for instance, a Linden who went on the Today Show. You had Paul Adderley who went on and defended the actions of the government and vehemently denied these reports. And went on and came on publicly and said, you know, our hands are clean. We have no dealings in this.
But the same Paul Adley had said, if I was to do my duty, then I would have to resign, somewhere to that effect. If he was to do what he, based on what the evidence that he had seen, somewhere to that effect, you know.
No, but I feel that, you know, despite what they said, the talk on the ground, the grapevine, did not follow that. You know, people still believe that there was corruption and that they had been involved in a lot of the things, and even worse than what came.
But also, you know, you had the level of independent thinkers. This was sinking in. And then we've had more of graduates who were coming back home from universities, and then you have these reports in the international press, A Nation for Sale, Lost Paradise, and all of these negative, that Of course, persons who are reading this and who are hearing this or seeing this on the television.
So by the time Mr. Ingram is leading the 1992 campaign, he spoke of things like accountability, government in the sunshine, things of that nature, which then, of course, ushered in the FNM rule in the FNM winning in 1992. Was he able to effectively deliver on that?
On the government in the sunshine concept
yes.
and accountability? I think that has been the theme of every FNM administration. They tried to be more accountable and to people and to be more transparent in their deliberations. If you think even of just the previous FNM government, that transparency was a big part of their philosophy. And they
but voters would say different. Not that we're here to talk about that, but voters did not feel, particularly in the last administration, that there was enough transparency.
Well, I feel that the FNM did a lot in terms of, you know, some of the legislation they passed and everything, just to bring about more accountability and
yes.
the way government was dealing.
But Mr. Ingram was, okay, let's go back. Mr. Ingram condemned what the involvement of the leadership of the PLP based on the Commission of Inquiry. Mm-hmm. Mr. Ingram was expelled from the PLP. So people will say, well, okay, here is now the person who's leading the FNM. Here's a man with the highest level of integrity. He's well prepared whenever he speaks. You know, every time he spoke, it was speeches of substance and speeches of hope that, okay, our country can be governed better. There's a better way of governing the Bahamas. The standard of living can be increased. But also, what Mr. Ingram, and I think even today it has that impact, Bahamians didn't really have a voice as such. You only heard from the one radio station or television station what the government wanted you to hear. And one of the first acts of this new government was to open the airways. And
that now brings me to my next question. The privatization of the airwaves, the opening up of the airwaves, I mean, which eventually led to how we are sitting here in this studio even today. The ending of that monopoly that the state-owned station had. What did that mean to the country? What did that started a new era in many ways, but in your opinion, what did that mean now to have free airwaves where people could go on and express themselves, whether for or against a government?
Well, one, it told them, okay, you are the boss. This is your government. So you have a right, if you are not pleased with certain things or how your country is being governed, you have a right to express that. And you have a right to give your views. You have a right to criticize any MP, your MP or anybody else.
And it gave people a forum. If, you know, there were things that you could not do or say, you could not get through going to the government-run station, and it gave people another forum in which to express themselves. There are people who jokingly say now that that was the worst thing we could have done because it hurt the FNM and many times when we suffered as a result. But at some point, you know, your country has to grow. You have to join the real world and bring your people up to a certain standard. And I think that opening the airwaves was one of the things that did that. It raised us to a higher level. And there were several other things that were done.
It was a very powerful instrument of deepening democracy.
One of the things, too, that happened shortly after Mr. Ingram and the FNM came to power is he began putting the proceedings of, or allowed for the proceedings of Parliament to be on television, and the opening of Parliament to be on the outside and viewed by everyone, and he called it government in the sunshine. That's right. I remember covering the opening of Parliament. But how did that even change how matters were debated and how the legislature behaved? Because now all of your actions are in front of the Bahamian public every time you are in the halls of Parliament.
Well, I'm hoping that it would bring a certain, or raise the level of decorum. I'm not sure that it's always the effect, yes. But, you know, it brought Parliament and the dealings in Parliament much closer to the people. So you did not have to go and be allowed in the gallery to hear what was going on or depend on the newspapers to report it. You could turn on your television and sit and listen and know what was happening all the time with your government. So it brought it closer to the people, and I think that was also a part of the transparency, you know. You don't have to wait to hear. You can see for yourself what we're saying as we say it.
We also, sorry, you want to say something there?
Yes, it even to a point basically gave the people a more direct access to what the government is doing. So the people felt as though they were a part of what was happening. They can see what their representatives were doing. And also, Mr. Ingram made some changes whereby, even as it relates to increases in salaries or certain things, that they had to go to Parliament, which before that, they were just done without going to Parliament. He made several changes in that respect. But also, Mr. Ingram said, well, the government that's closer to the people is more effective. So you go into local government, you go into the school boards.
So things like local government and school boards also, well, local government especially came about, I think in the second, I think it was the second administration. We've talked a lot about Mr. Ingram, but within those first 5 years, he obviously didn't go it alone. He had a cabinet of quite a few individuals who were first-timers in government. Many had not served previously in government. And I know even though in that period you all would have served in the Senate, but what was that like, having a lot of novices in the cabinet, even though some had been in politics for many years, but had never served in cabinet and never been at that level of making decisions. What was that like, particularly those first 5 years?
Now, I remember that for the time that I was in the Senate, that there was a lot discussed in our parliamentary meetings where our senators and all of our elected members were present, or certainly were able to be present. And a lot of what the government was doing was discussed, and we all had our input. So people didn't have to really go it alone in terms of handling their ministries. And they were able, or they learned really to tap into the resources that were there. We have some very capable civil servants in all these ministries, and I think they used them to the full extent. And also, there was opportunity for input from all of the parliamentarians, not just the cabinet, and I think that helped to guide them through those early years.
Were there, and I know this doesn't always happen in politics, but were there times that you know of where there was consultation with the opposition on things that were happening on a national level? Was there any kind of meeting of the minds between Mr. Ingram, his cabinet, and his MPs, and then Sir Lyndon and the PLP in opposition? Was there ever a coming together that you know of, whether it be in public or even behind closed doors?
I know there was, as it relates to the first referendum. In fact, we had gotten agreement. There was agreement between both sides. The PLP had agreed that they would support the items on the referendum. But then I think after the noise on the outside and other persons, some spiritual leaders and others thought otherwise, and they had a change of mind.
Okay, we are going to take a quick break. If you're enjoying our discussion, stay with us. We are going to be back with more on the record right after this.
So the project really pays itself back. They
Correct.
set up
At the conference, the school.
As a journalist, I always have to focus on the facts, and sometimes that means going to investigate for myself. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. right here on RTV.
And we're back with our discussion, FNM 30 years since the call to governance. One of the more significant things that happened during that first term was the calling of 3 commissions of inquiry. There was one on Bahamas Air, then Batelco, and the Hotel Corporation of the Bahamas, which is pretty much non-existent now in many ways. But there was a lot of time, money, energy spent on these commissions. There were reports produced, but people thought that more should happen. We haven't really had any sense, but people were looking for more. Do you think, or in hindsight, was this just an exercise to expose what was happening, an exercise in embarrassment, or was it something that was necessary for us to have a look into the workings of these institutions?
Well, I think the exposure, for one, is to make those the MPs more conscious of these things happening. I think many persons expected prosecutions. You know, that didn't happen. I don't know exactly what mindset Mr. Ingram and his government was of at that particular time. You know, but it exposed quite a bit, you know. And so I would think that the MPs then and those that came afterward would know, okay, you know, you have a fiduciary responsibility, you know, to respect the law and to oversee with integrity those areas that you have responsible for, and you know the resources are the people's, the money are the people's. So it's not nothing that you can treat as though it's your personal property, your personal goods, or it's from that point. Some persons, I hope they would have learned from it. I don't know whether they did. But.
We shall see. During this first term as well, and even into the second, a lot of women rose to positions of prominence within the Ingram administration, most notably Janet Bostwick, but there were others who served in that first cabinet, namely the late Teresa Moxie Ingram, Ivy Dumont, even later went on to have the first female Speaker of the House in 1997, following the 1997 election, I think it was, Talia Johnson. But you yourself also served in the Senate within that period, not exactly at 92, I think it was maybe around 94 or 95, 94 you came into the Senate. But what did that do to change the face of politics, well, change the face of women in politics?
Well, I think it forever changed the face of politics. Prior to that, you know, Janet Bostwick was a trailblazer. She was pretty much on her own out there representing women and showing that women can get the job done. But I think the Ingram administration was perhaps the first administration that really focused on getting women involved and, you know, recruited and encouraged women to get involved in frontline politics, and also to use them in, you know, cabinet and other positions of prominence in the country. And I think that really paved the way for what we see now. You know, many women are coming forward and many women are holding positions throughout the government. And I think that would have started, I think that started really with the push that the Ingram administration made.
How was that accepted by the men in politics at the time? You know, it's a boys' club. And I remember a former guest woman told me on the show one time that, you know, women were just sort of placeholders and being put in seats where they know they couldn't have possibly won. But, you know, what was it like for the men in politics now to be seated at the cabinet table and other positions of authority alongside women?
Well, it was not new. In the region, you had Dominique at the time. They had a female prime minister. Then you had Thatcher in the UK. And so it was not new that women had excelled to that level of leadership within the region and elsewhere. But I didn't see where the men showed any problem with working along with women. In fact, it was they were quite an asset, all of the women that were involved. In fact, Mr. Ingram and even the FNM hoping that they would have gotten more women, you know. And in the FNM now, the women, the positions they held, they were not just they weren't tokens. They were substantive, serious. They had authority. These were, unlike before, these were genuine positions that they held, and they made a difference.
History will show that Mr. Ingram had a very aggressive agenda in the first 5 years of governance. Probably one of the most aggressive agendas, I think, in history. Given, I remember very clearly, it just seemed like every day we were doing something, following him, going somewhere, announcing something, opening something. What were those first 5 years like from a country perspective, given all that he had on his agenda?
When he came to power, the bottom of the economy basically was falling out. Remember, it was at the time when the PLP could not even borrow the monies that you know. The facts are they attempted at one point to borrow 200+ million. They were only able to raise, I think, less than 10% of that. Tourists, at that time we were talking about in the country, it was widely said, okay, we're just attracting these chicken in the bag tourists. So the economy, the quality of their lives was deteriorating. You know, the schools, the infrastructure, whether it's going to be in healthcare with clinics or the major hospitals, or whether it's going to be with the schools, whether it's going to be at the network of roads, traffic congestion. So there were a lot of things that were bringing a lot of stress on persons. But the economy, first and foremost. Remember, during those first few months and so, there was a strong emphasis, jobs. We got to create jobs. We got to create jobs. Because lots of people were hurting, financially hurting. And then we said, look here, our country has been tarnished. We've got to turn that around. And so Mr. Ingram, he's a type of person, and he had the full support of his cabinet of, look, let's do whatever we can as quickly as we can, because we don't know what may happen afterwards. And remember now, Mr. Ingram was sworn in on the 21st of August. Hurricane Andrew came on the 23rd of August. And so there was no period.
There was no honeymoon.
No honeymoon. There was not even a period just to take a nap. Instantly, he had to start working. Even before the cabinet was sworn in, they had this catastrophic Category 5 Hurricane Andrew that had struck the Bahamas. And that spoke volumes of the measure of the man, his capacity, his focus, his level of organization, his commitment to making Bahamas better.
I just before we go to the break, your memory of those first 5 years, what were they like?
Well, to my mind, I think Mr. Ingram looked around at some of our systems. That was what I was impressed with, and said, you know, why are they operating in this way? One of the things that stands out is, for instance, the licensing of cars once a year. And he changed that, which makes it, you know, we tend to forget these things, but that made life so much easier. Yeah, and it was chaotic. So he changed that. He did some things with the flow of traffic to make it a little easier, the turnaround of Bay Street and that, on all of the work on the schools. He had a big focus on education and the children and the environment in which they learn. And I think under his governance, we saw a big change in the schools and the way they looked. And you know, he just looked around and it seemed to me that he was always thinking, how can we improve? What system can we change now to make it easier for the people?
We're at the point of our final break. We've got a few more things to discuss with our panel tonight. Stay with us. You are watching On the Record. Our final segment is right after this. The project really pays itself back.
Correct.
They set up
At the conference, the school.
As a journalist, I always have to focus on the facts, and sometimes that means going to investigate for myself. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. right here on RTV.
You're watching On the Record, and we are back. This is our final segment of our show tonight. We're going down memory lane. For lots of folks, it is a reminder. For many, hopefully, it is an education. Some things that they did not know or may never have heard about. Mrs. Smith, you were the 52nd Speaker of the House of Assembly, having taken up office on May 23rd, 2007. How has Parliament changed from what you have observed from those years? I mean, at that point, the FNM had returned to office, having lost in 2002, but now had come back to office. You were elected Speaker. But how has Parliament changed? And you would have been serving in the Senate during the first administration in 1992. And when I say Parliament, I mean the upper and lower chamber, Senate and House of Assembly. But really, from where you sit, and you would even have served as Vice President of the Senate at one point. But how is, again to my initial question, how has Parliament changed? My observation is that the parliamentarians of decades prior to, they showed more interest in representing the people. Many of the parliamentarians now, it seems to be all about me. You know, I'm in front of the camera, let me put on a good show. But that genuine, authentic representation of the people, many times I don't see that. And there were several cases I saw persons there, and I wonder what was their purpose for coming here, why they wanted to be there. People in the party as well? On both sides. You know, I saw several persons like that. They liked the attention, the national attention and so forth. And so for some of them, it's a show, you know. And I would have spoken to some of them and said, listen, you know, try whenever you, don't try to just be there like you want to just be making noise or like a cheerleader. You've got to, you know your purpose for coming here. You know, you're here to represent the people. You're here to make lives better for the people. You're here to generally contribute when you can make a difference as to how we can move this country forward and so forth. What I used to do when I was teaching at the time, before I got into politics, there were times when I would go to the House of Assembly and just sit
and listen to some of the debates.
Because they were on that level.
Right. And then I would try to read some things relevant to Parliament.
Now, I have to ask, I wouldn't be doing my job. We have had some controversial speakers and some controversial moments from that speaker's chair. As you see some of this evolving, what is your take on some of the controversy that surrounds the speaker and what's happening in the speaker's chair?
Well, it's I don't offer public comments as to how I feel about certain things, but the speaker is the referee. The speaker is there just to be impartial, to make sure that the decorum is upheld, that there is order in the place. But as it relates to making the show about me, the speaker, no, that should never happen. That should never happen. And mind you, you've got to have a lot of patience. You've got to be very, very tolerant. You've got to be very, very composed. Even when there's something that annoys you, you cannot show or verbalize that, you know. You've got to maintain your composure. And then with this, you see, the speaker has to also protect the minority, because sometimes the majority will try to just take advantage of the minority. Now, what is important, very, very important, is that the relationship between the speaker and the leader of the government, the leader of the opposition.
Why is that so important?
That is important because you want to maintain that level of respect. You would never, a speaker, I can't even think of how egregious the leader of the opposition must, what act he must do for him to be put out of Parliament. Also, the leader of the government must understand that, okay, the speaker is not going to just see you as the prime minister, because you in the House you're just the leader really just leader of the governing party.
Mm-hmm.
And so the speaker is not always is going to be following or doing what you expect him to do. The speaker has to be fair.
Mm-hmm.
But
I think perhaps what's needed is more training, more coaching, and so that you understand your role and not overplay your hand as the speaker who's in control of the House.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we've seen that happen in the current administration and the previous administration. So I think we need to put a little bit more time into training speakers. Understood.
So as we prepare to wrap up, I've got to ask now, what is next for the FNM in this time since the election? Your party lost substantially at the polls last September. You now have a new leader, but you also have a former leader who is still there. What is next for the FNM?
Well, let me just say that I'm encouraged that our former leader is still there, because he can lend his experience and his knowledge to the whatever goes on in the party.
But you do accept, though, that people see him as undermining the current leader.
I understand that. I don't know the extent to which it's true, but I guess it makes good fodder for gossip and whatever. But I'm excited for the party. I don't like being in opposition, but I see a lot of young people emerging. I see a lot of women who are now becoming interested more than they had in the past in politics. We have a young, energetic, and to my mind, a very dynamic young leader, and I'm excited to see what he would bring to the table. So I think the future for the FNM is very bright. We have a lot of talent there that we can draw on, and our organizations, our Women's Association in particular, and our torchbearers, they're just doing a lot of things, and I see a lot of leaders and future politicians emerging.
Interesting. Mr. Smith, what is the future of the FNM, and is a Hubert Ingram involved in that in any way?
The future looks bright. Very, very optimistic. As my colleague has referred, there's a cadre of young people, dynamic young people, very talented young people. We are delighted to have them just getting involved. Mm-hmm. They're intimately involved in what, as it relates to, and relate to our rebound and strengthening and regrouping. They're very much involved.
Well, the question I have, and many other people, the role of Mr. Ingram.
Mr. Ingram is there. He makes himself available to the leader of the opposition, and they speak regularly. When I say very regularly, and he's offered himself to assist the leader of the opposition, and not just the leader of the opposition. You find other persons, other MPs, and also sometimes MPs from the other side, from the governing side, the younger MPs would call Mr. Ingram just to get his advice on certain things.
So no truth to this narrative that he may not be supporting the current leader?
No, he is supporting the current leader.
I don't believe that.
He is supporting the current leader. Mm-hmm. He is supporting the current leader.
And I think Mr. Ingram is a resource that we can't afford to ignore. He
very
has
valuable.
Just too much knowledge, too much talent that he can pass on, and I think he owes it to generations to come into the country to pass that knowledge on to the upcoming.
Yes. But Jerome, a point I would like to make here. Before 1992, we did not have universal internet. We did not have universal cable in the Bahamas. Cable was only in Grand Bahama. Internet was something that came on afterward, all the entire Bahamas. Because some of the young people believe that this was always the situation. These things were always existed. They believed that, we always had several radio stations,
These are all, in the past 30 years. Yeah. So, a good point for us to end on. I think that it's always important for us to keep history in context so we know where we have come from. Mm-hmm. As I said at the beginning of this show, sometimes I think as we move through politics, we try to rearrange history, as you would have said to me, to erase or to change the things we don't like. But history is what it is. Mr. Smith, Mr. Dorset, thank you so much for coming on. It has been wonderful. Good to see you again.
Yes, it's our pleasure. It's my pleasure.
Yes, I've spent many years as a young reporter covering you all. And so thank you for agreeing to come on and continuing to share wisdom with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
All right. Well, before we go, we want to thank Mr. Derek Smith for his historic photos we were able to display to you tonight. Our topic, FNM 30 years since the call to governance. Join us next week for another exciting topic that directly affects the lives of Bahamians. Until then, I'm your host, Jerome Sawyer. We'll see you again soon.